Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to you all. This is Canada's most irreverent talk show, midway through the week already. That's the benefit of a shorter week on this Wednesday, July 3rd. We are right in the middle of Canada Day and Independence Day. So if you're someone who is afflicted with dual loyalties, you get two holidays out of the mix. So hopefully you have a good Independence Day tomorrow. We will be here in full strength irreverence here on Canada's most irreverent talk show. We've got a busy show today. Going to be speaking later on with lawyer Josh Dehaas. I just saw on the camera, there's like a fly that's just taunting me behind me. He wants to be famous, or she. I don't want to misgender the fly. So if you hear swatting when we're throwing up a graphic, that's why, because eventually he's gotten the better of me. But that is where we're already starting off today. But the one thing I will point out, we'll have Josh Dehaas on the show, and we'll be talking about the injunction that was granted to clear out the anti-Israel encampment at the University of Toronto. Also later on, why the federal government's electric vehicle mandate is on track to decimate Canada's auto industry. That's coming up in a little bit later on as well with Ross McKitrick, fantastic economist from the University of Guelph. But I want to begin by talking about a story that we've been covering pretty, I don't want to say religiously, but pretty consistently for the last several years. And that is Canada's curious relationship with the World Economic Forum. And let me just say, first and foremost, this is not about conspiracy theories. This is not about some, hidden cabal of people pulling the strings of the world leaders from their lair in the Swiss Alps. This is about an organization that is very open and very honest about its mandate, about its agenda, and people such as Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland that are very willing and eager and enthusiastic participants of that agenda, as evidenced by the fact that Chrystia Freeland, who is Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, still sits on the board of trustees for the World Economic Forum. And I've said you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to just imagine the conflict of interest there. We would not like the Deputy Prime Minister of our country to sit on some corporate board or the board of some nonprofit that wants to get things out of the government. So why should we be happy with her sitting on the board of an organization that has a policy agenda that it wants countries, including Canada, to implement? It doesn't take a rocket science. I mean, we're talking about Chrystia Freeland, but even so, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out where the issues are going to come here. Well, then you have the lack of transparency. While the World Economic Forum is very enthusiastic about promoting its agenda, they live stream most of their sessions, there's another Davos that takes place that you can only see when you're there, and even then, not really. And I've gleaned this from my coverage of Davos for the last 3 years. And you have all of these multilateral meetings that take place that aren't on any public agendas, meeting lists, participant lists, nothing really disclosed about it. And you actually have no idea what world leaders are committing to behind closed doors when they sit down in meeting rooms with the CEOs of this bank, of this corporation, the leader of this government, of this NGO, in a way that they would never really be able to do back home in Canada without there being more scrutiny. So this brings us to an order paper question, which is a mechanism that you can file in the House of Commons to get an answer from the government, basically. It was a question filed by Conservative MP Leslyn Lewis to try to get a sense of, let's put the question up there. She wanted to know who Chrystia Freeland was meeting with. She wanted to know what she was doing and how much it cost Canadians. And you think, okay, this is a reasonable question. Freeland was there with a delegation of Canadian government leaders. This is what she asked for specifically. Leslyn Lewis wants to know the members of the delegation, their name, title, role, the details of all meetings, the dates of the meetings, the names and titles of attendees, the purpose, the agenda items, a summary of what occurred. She wants the full minutes of every meeting Chrystia Freeland took in Davos while she was supposedly representing Canadians. And then you look at the response that she got from the finance department. All generalities. Oh, she met with a number of people. She met with members of the Ukrainian delegation, a variety of business leaders. She met with foreign government leaders. She met with a few specifics there that are named, but that was only on the public panel. So Chrystia Freeland, as you saw on that document there, is not interested in disclosing the meetings that she took place outside of the one that was live streamed. It's all generalities. Oh, she met with lots of people, business leaders, all of that. And I'm left wondering, what on earth were you doing for Canada and for Canadians? Now, I did a little look today at the government's travel costs. They publish these things on a website after a certain period of time. And I saw that the government spent about $40,000 on sending its delegates to the World Economic Forum annual meeting this year. Chrystia Freeland was spending $12,170. That included her business class airfare with Air Canada, Toronto to Zurich. She brought along a couple of staffers. One of them charged $6,000. One of them charged $8,000. One of them charged just a paltry $2,356. It's not clear how he came in so low, and I looked at it in a bit more detail, and he billed zero for accommodations, which either he was deciding to live out homeless on the streets of Davos, or perhaps he hasn't filed those receipts yet. And then the really interesting one to me, Jody Thomas, who was the National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. Jody Thomas racked up $11,520 for this trip. Now, this trip was January 12th to 15th. Jody Thomas retired from her job less than 2 weeks later. She retired on January 28th. So what a nice little retirement trip. You get to go into Davos when you know you're going to be clearing out your desk the second you get home. And we're still on the hook for her to be there. For what reason, I have no idea. I know she did some round table with other national security advisors, but again, not exactly clear what Canadians got out of it. So asking what Canadians are getting out of this seems to be a reasonable question that the Liberal government simply does not want to answer. Now, I have attempted on a number of occasions to speak to Chrystia Freeland about this. I actually tried to get some time with her this year in Davos. I couldn't even find her. Perhaps she was still a little bit sore about me finding her last year when I was there, and attempting to ask again a very simple question. Take a look.
Hi, Minister. Andrew Lawton, True North. I was just wondering if it's a conflict of interest for you to be a trustee while also a cabinet minister. Are you proud of the work? And if so, why is there an issue answering a question about it? Enjoy your panel, Minister.
That was, again, a very I don't even know if you can call it an interview. It was a little bit one-sided, a couple of questions, zero intention on her part to respond to it. The question was a very simple one. How do you justify being a trustee with this organization while also serving as a cabinet minister in Canada? And is this not a conflict of interest? And if she is so proud of this work, and if it is so important, then just answer the darn question. I mean, Christine Lagarde, I've played the clip a number of times, so I won't make you watch it again if you don't want to. But Christine Lagarde, who's the head of the European Central Bank, she gave me my favorite answer that I've ever heard from one of the Davos elites this year when I asked her, I think it was about digital currency or something, and she just said, "Oh, I'm not doing interviews right now because I'm in a quiet period." Which is, again, as I joked, I've tried that with my wife. It has not worked when I don't want to answer a question. Oh, no. I'm in a quiet period. It's all good. I'm taking no questions. But the World Economic Forum loves pretending it's being transparent. They love pretending. I was very fortunate. I went for the first time in 2022, and I had pulled one Davos guy aside and asked him a couple of questions, and he stopped and answered them, and I didn't quite agree with what he said, but I was glad he took the time. And that gentleman, whose name is Adrian Monk, actually made sure that I got accredited the next year. So when I went in 2023, I was there not as a white badge Davos elite, but I was a lowly orange badge journalist relegated to the press room. But even so, it was a place to get out of the cold. I was able to get a bit more access, not a huge amount more. And he did this because, for whatever it's worth, he believes in the organization, and he believes that they have nothing to hide, and that there is more of a benefit in having people, even their critics, inside to see what's going on. I appreciated that. I was clear to behave. I didn't, steal too much food from the snack cart. I didn't, knock over the hot chocolate cart. I didn't, go in and start body checking people out of the way. I was a very, very polite journalist. I, didn't even yell at Klaus Schwab when he tried to, get away from me to go into the other room. I was very, very polite. And despite that, I was not allowed to cover it the next year. That was this year. I was relegated to the streets once again. And as it happened, you still get pretty decent access as people are coming and going. Okay, we're doing the Christine Lagarde. It's too much fun to nausea. This was Christine Lagarde, and that was this year.
Good afternoon, ma'am. How can people have confidence in digital currencies and government not using it as a tool of control?
I'm not giving an interview. I'm not speaking because I'm in a quiet period.
I'm in a quiet period. I'm not speaking. And again, the theme of the conference there was rebuilding trust. But there is not really an interest in these people in rebuilding trust because they believe that distrust in them is everyone else's fault. And it's amazing the verbal semantics, the gymnastics that you see from so many of these people. Just to bring it back to a domestic context for a moment, you had today or yesterday it was on Power and Politics, Mark Garrettson, who is the member. I'm trying to think of how I would describe him. Like he's from Kingston area, which is imagine how far we've fallen. That Kingston once gave us John A. Macdonald. And now we get Mark Garrettson. But Mark Garrettson, anyway, the man who is searching for a second IQ point to rub against the first one, was there to do the Liberal government's spin on CBC. And they were talking about a number of things, talking about the Toronto St. Paul's by-election. They were talking about the carbon tax. And he had a very strange way of describing why he thinks the carbon tax matters to Canadians.
Do you need to change cabinet? Do you need to change staff? Or is it just policy change? What is it?
I think it's more along the lines of our communication and a policy. You know, you brought up the carbon tax earlier and Ken McDonald's point on that. The carbon tax has been around since 2018. We've had a carbon tax since 2018. The scheduled increases since 2018. It didn't really become an issue until Pierre Poilievre made it an issue 8 or 9 months ago. And that has to do with a communication issue and less to do with a policy issue. So I think there's a lot of stuff built into that, and a lot of stuff for us to self-reflect on that, yes, we can do in a joint meeting together, or we can do individually. I know the Prime Minister has been doing a lot of outreach in the last few days, reaching out to colleagues throughout the country to have discussions with them about that exactly.
Canadians are only caring about the carbon tax now because Pierre Poilievre is making them care about it. I believe that's what the kids these days call a self-own, when he's really admitting that Pierre Poilievre is the one that is responsible for the narrative of Canadian politics right now. The Canadians are more interested in what Pierre Poilievre has to say about things than they are in what Mark Garrettson and Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland have to say in things. And I find that to be an incredibly fascinating admission on his part. Now, it's not perhaps that the carbon tax has been continuously increased by the Liberals and that the carbon tax is compounded in its effect because we're dealing with rampant inflation. It's not that we are in the midst of a cost of living crisis and this carbon tax that isn't doing anything is just punitive to Canadians. No, it couldn't have been any of that. The only reason Canadians care is because Justin Trudeau just started talking about it. Pierre Poilievre, there's a Freudian slip, just started talking about it 8 to 9 months ago. Very, very strange way of coping with the flagging fortunes for the Liberals. And you, of course, see all sorts of attempts at really getting to the bottom of what's wrong with society right now and what's wrong with Conservatives. If you talk to the Toronto Star, Bruce Arthur, who is ostensibly a sports columnist, but seems to not really care about writing about sports that much, he had one column in the Toronto Star yesterday that I found hilarious. People should be afraid. Are you fearful? Are you afraid? Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives have been targeting experts. Is this just the beginning? And he goes into the piece a number of examples of where Conservatives have criticized so-called experts, whether it's Andrea Sarita on so-called safe supply, whether it is Andrew Leach, the economist, who I don't think has ever said a kind word about any Conservative, and just in general, this expertocracy that we're supposed to just be so deferential to. And when I saw this, I was thinking, which experts are we talking about here? Before I had read the piece, are we talking about the experts who said that masks don't work before mandating them? Are we talking about the experts who said closing borders is racist before they closed them? Are we talking about the experts who said don't worry about inflation, it's just transitory? Are we talking about the experts that have told us that there's no way Donald Trump will win the 2016 election? Are we talking about the experts that have said all these sorts of things that have been proven incorrect? I think we are. And the Liberals, the left, they're sycophants in much of the media anyway, if Bruce Arthur is fitting that bill, believe wholeheartedly that you can put a PhD in front of someone's, or I guess behind someone's name, put a doctor in front of their name, and we're all supposed to just treat them with utter deference, that you are above criticism, that you are above scrutiny, even when these people have been responsible in many ways for the things that are wrong with this country. So the Conservatives, whether you like them or not, are not treating the so-called expert class as being the sacred cow. And of course, that is terrifying. Put that headline back up from Bruce Arthur there, if you can, Sean. This is the framing of this article. people should be afraid. No, the people who should be afraid are the ones that have been coasting on this so-called expert class, that have been coasting on this desired technocracy that they've been trying to implement in Canada. Those are the people who should be afraid, because the gravy train is coming to an end. We will revisit this as the show progresses, but I want to go into a bit more of a newsy topic here. Yesterday, the injunction that the University of Toronto sought to dismantle the anti-Israel encampment on campus was granted. And this means that as of today, police are going to be moving in. They've said they plan on enforcing this injunction. I want to talk about this from a constitutional liberty perspective here, and also the broader implications. Josh Dehaas returns to the show. He's a lawyer with the Canadian Constitution Foundation and one of the hosts of their tremendous podcast, digging into many of these issues. Josh, good to talk to you as always. Thanks for coming on.
Great to be here. Thanks, Andrew.
Let me just start with the first, the glaring question here of why an injunction was even necessary when you had what, I mean, at its core was a trespassing issue. Like, presumably if someone were to set up a camp on my front lawn, I could call the police without going to a judge and say, please remove them. Why did it need to go to this stage?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's a question we've been getting a lot because, police can enforce trespass laws. And this was very clearly a trespass from the beginning. Trespass just means going onto somebody's property without lawful justification. And there's an old English case that says merely bruising the grass is going to count as trespass. So what you had here was people, deciding who was allowed to go into this space on campus, right in the center of the University of Toronto. And you had to, pass a series of questions to sort of get into this encampment. So it was just quite obvious it was a trespass. And, in York University in Toronto, as you well know, Andrew, police just went in and enforced the law against trespass the day the encampment was set up. So what I think happened here was basically U of T decided that they were going to negotiate and that they were going to let this encampment sort of fester for at least a short period of time before they decided to, seek legal action. And the protesters had an argument, which was essentially that they have freedom of expression rights protected by the Constitution, freedom of assembly rights to use this otherwise private property at U of T. And they had just a little tiny bit of an argument, which was that this free speech directive that Doug Ford had put in place in 2018 somehow meant that after decades of law in Ontario saying the charter doesn't apply to these types of university actions, that all of a sudden the government had decided that they wanted it to apply. So I think Toronto police looked at that and they said, okay, there's some legal uncertainty here. And you had law professors out there sort of siding with the protesters saying this directive means that now the charter does apply to campus. And just based on that legal uncertainty, I think they probably had advice to wait and see what happens with the court case. And not all that surprisingly, the injunction has been granted.
Just as an aside, I think it's a bit rich that these protesters, many of whom have called for, any professor associated with Israel to, be sent to the gulag, are all of a sudden these newfound defenders of academic freedom.
Yeah, and a lot of these people are the same people who, they would have canceled just about anybody involved with the trucker protest if they tried to speak on campus a few years ago. I remember if there was any talk about race or gender that didn't align with sort of progressive shibboleths, they would go on campus and pull the fire alarms and try and get people try and get their expression shut down. So
yeah, but all of a sudden Doug Ford's free speech directive might not be such a bad idea for them.
Yeah.
Does it, from a legal perspective, does it have any bearing at all on whether they are students or faculty who generally have, I think, a right to use the campus?
From a constitutional perspective, I don't think it has really any bearing on it at all. But a lot of this case was decided based on University of Toronto's own policies, and they have, use of space policies and speech policies. And I think under those policies, they are going to, they care a lot more about what professors and students are doing because that's part of their mission, right? So under those policies, it might matter that they're students or that they're professors, but from a general constitutional law perspective, it doesn't really matter all that much. And frankly, the respondents in this case, I think most of them, if not all of them, were students.
Have we gotten to a point, or I maybe this is a stupid question because it sounds self-evident as I'm formulating in my head, but what I was gonna ask is, are these policies just so far from being content neutral in that, like, the way these things are enforced in any academic freedom context, in any public assembly context on campus, depends entirely on the specific expression and rather the fundamentals?
I think that was certainly the case up until fairly recently, but I think the whole debate about expression and academic freedom on campus that arose after October 7th really woke a lot of people up on the sort of the progressive left, who tend to be the people enforcing these policies, that they need to be a little bit more principled about these things. So I think that's sort of the silver lining here, is that, if you go back 3 years, 5 years, there was a lot of shutting down of legitimate speech and legitimate academic research and lectures on campus. And I think we're going to see less of that, hopefully, going forward, because I think people might have learned their lesson this time around, that it's not just, right-wing voices that are being canceled, but also that sometimes there are, pro-Palestinian voices that are more closely associated with the left that get canceled, and that we want to have the same rule for everybody so that that rule will be there when we need it.
Obviously, police, I mean, like we saw with the Freedom Convoy, police were really trying to get people to just leave on their own volition, and it didn't really work too well. They're trying to do the same thing here, but the protesters have basically said they, have no interest in packing up and going home in a lot of cases. And there's always the possibility that something like this is the Streisand effect, where now more people will descend on it. So this could be very messy as things go on. If someone doesn't leave, what are they facing right now? Is it the, $70 trespassing ticket?
I think it's more serious than that, to be honest. So if people don't leave, and I noticed there was a union, CUPE Ontario, that's encouraging people to go down at 3:30 this afternoon and join the protest. And, this was the union whose head, Fred Hahn, famously said he was going to use his own body to, stop this protest from getting shut down. And if the deadline passes, which is 6 p.m. for people to leave, and people are still there, we don't know what time it's going to happen, but we do know Toronto police are going to go in and enforce that. And that means they're going to physically remove people, and people will be thrown in jail potentially. And a lot of them will face potentially even contempt of court charges, depending on how serious that is. And that's a really big deal. Like, you will, you can go to jail for a serious amount of time for contempt of court. So I think it's really kind of irresponsible to encourage people to stay at this point when the protesters had their day in court. They got to make all their arguments, and now it's time to respect the rule of law, in case there was a lack of clarity before that you were trespassing, that you didn't have a right to be there.
If someone is charged, does that constitutional question then, if they choose to go that road, really start again? And do they, get to, in their defense, basically try again with the whole, no, I had a constitutional right to be there?
I don't know how much bearing that would have on the actual contempt of court, but yeah, if there was a trespass charge, they'd probably be able to make, charter arguments again, and who knows how that will go. But I mean, the fact that the judge just took a very detailed look at this, this is an injunction decision. An injunction is just, what's going to happen until we can hear the full hearing in a way that avoids irreparable harm. That is normally a pretty short decision. This is 98 pages. Like, the judge took, 2 days of hearing people out. There were all kinds of interveners that submitted arguments, and the judge really meticulously went through the evidence. And there was a lot of evidence on the record already and the law, and came to a conclusion. So I think that would be highly influential to any other judge that has to consider, whether there's a charter issue here.
I know there are obviously different courts in different provinces, but where did this judge diverge from, apart from on the decision, from Quebec, when the injunction request against McGill was rejected?
Yeah, so the big difference here is when McGill was asking for an injunction to get rid of their encampment on campus, they did that. What they were seeking was called an interim injunction, and that is something that's basically like you're saying there is an emergency and we need to go to court today or tomorrow or the next day. And the other side, they don't really have a lot of time to build their argument and put together, affidavits and evidence. And so if you're going to court and saying this is an emergency, you need to shut this down right away, that's going to be a really high bar to get over to convince a judge that we have to end this thing right away. And that's different than what happened here, where, we're more than a month into it before U of T initiated these proceedings, and the judge gave them weeks of time to get their evidence together. So we have a much fuller record. And so the judge can feel confident saying, yes, there's a strong prima facie case that U of T is right here about the trespass. And I think that's the main difference, is just that what McGill was asking for was sort of an emergency injunction. And this is something that's a little further down the line with better evidence and arguments.
Fair enough. Josh Dehaas, lawyer with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. What's coming up on the podcast?
Oh, well, we'll be talking about this. We're going to be talking about sanctions against the Quesnel, BC mayor. He's now suing City Council because they sanctioned him for his choice in books.
Not even. It was his wife's choice in books.
Well, there's a little bit of dispute about that. So, at the beginning, it was his wife who was handing out this books, and the book's called A Grave Error. I believe True North is involved in that book. Mm-hmm. And it originally was his wife who was handing out this book. And I think everybody was asking, what does this have to do with the mayor's job that his wife is handing out this book? But I think he does admit at some point that maybe he did try to recommend this book to a couple people. Ooh, oh no, he recommended
the plot
a book.
thickens.
And he may have even said at some point that it should be in the public library, that people should be able to access a controversial book in the library.
Yeah, you can't say that in this day and age, that a book should be in the library, heaven forbid. All right. Well, we look forward to that, Josh. Thanks for coming on as always.
All right. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Take care.
All right. Thank you. Josh Dehaas from the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Just returning to how we started things off for a moment here. I mentioned, Chrystia Freeland's unwillingness to share the details of her little, political dalliance in Davos earlier this year. And again, I'm not even suggesting that anything untoward happened there. The point is, whenever you are having these meetings that take place behind closed doors, Canadians are paying tens of thousands of dollars for them. And at the end, we come out with the question of, okay, was it a waste of time? And you weren't doing anything, and you were just having fun and dining high and flying high and all that. Not like, like smoking pot or whatever. Anyway, I was mixing my metaphors. You'll have to forgive me. But, or were you doing things substantive? And if you're doing things substantive, then the question is, well, tell us what? Tell us with whom you were meeting and what you agreed on and all of that. And it's interesting how little this government likes the idea of scrutiny, how little they like the idea of democratic accountability. Justin Trudeau was speaking this morning, the Prime Minister. He's still facing calls from inside the House for his resignation. But what was interesting today is that he had a very curious way of explaining why he should be reelected after having served already close to 10 years. Take a look.
It doesn't matter whether you're a Liberal or a Conservative in Canada. Voters tend to give Prime Ministers, or have always given Prime Ministers in the last 100 plus years, the door after 9 or 10 years. Why do you think you're different?
Listen, there is a challenge faced by democracies all around the world right now. Whether we look at what's going on in France, whether we look at the election in the United States, whether we look at any democracy around the world, where we are seeing increasing challenges to people's well-beings, greater anxieties, an erosion of democratic principles and rights, this is a really important time for governments to step up and deliver concretely for citizens, to restore and encourage faith in the institutions that are there, to deliver things like more childcare spaces, to deliver better access to dental care for people who don't have insurance, to deliver more housing with the most ambitious housing plan this country has ever seen. These are the things that we need to stay focused on, and that's exactly what I'm working hard on right now.
It takes a lot to make Mark Gerritsen look like an intellectual heavyweight. But I think Justin Trudeau did it there. Why should Canadians vote for you for more than 3 terms was basically the question from, it sounded like Marika Walsh of the Globe and Mail. And he said, well, democracy is under threat around the world. We're seeing this with what happened in France and what's happening in the US. So his view of democracy being under attack and democratic institutions eroding is left-wingers losing elections. Like in the US right now, Joe Biden doesn't even know he's running for president. That is not an erosion of democracy. That is the Democrats fielding a terrible candidate. In France, it was people being fed up with Emmanuel Macron that led to an overhaul of their political process. It's the same thing that happened in Netherlands with Geert Wilders being elected. It's the same thing that's happening in countries around the world. It's not an erosion of democracy when people vote against you, but Justin Trudeau thinks it is. And what's fascinating here is that Justin Trudeau is really trying to set the stage for explaining and justifying and rationalizing his loss. That's what he's doing here. He's trying to make it so that when he loses, which I suspect will happen, the polls are showing what they show. What Justin Trudeau is saying here is that the polling, the eventual loss, is not his fault. It's part of a global erosion of democracy. That's what he's going to say. Justin Trudeau is going to be Canada's election denier. When Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives likely win a massive majority, that's what the polls are suggesting, Trudeau is going to say, oh, well, this was part of a global shift. This was part of a global shift. It had nothing to do with me. I'm not the unpopular one. It's just like Mark Garrett's is saying, oh, no, I'm not the guy that you need to look at here. Don't worry, the carbon tax, no one dislikes the policy. People just don't like that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives have been talking about it. That's where this is all coming from. This is another clip from Justin Trudeau, basically just doing the everything is fine routine when forced with, actually, no, we'll get to that clip later. In the meantime, I want to bring into this discussion here one of Trudeau's environmental policies that, again, is all virtue signaling and very little in the way of substance behind it, the electric vehicle mandate. We are supposed to be staring down the barrel of all light-duty vehicles, so basically consumer cars being electric or hybrid by 2035. It may seem like it's a long way away, but that is just about a decade, and there is a very stark warning by economist Ross McKitrick in the Financial Post about what this mandate is going to mean and is meaning for the auto sector. Professor Ross McKitrick joins us once again. Always good to see you, Ross. Thanks for coming on today.
Hi, Andrew. Always a pleasure.
So let's just start with the rationalization for this, because it's based on this idea that this is going to solve or at least contribute to the solution to all of these economic and environmental woes. But the economic argument we've seen really falls apart on electric vehicles. They are not desirable by consumers. They are not particularly profitable for automakers without massive subsidies. Like, where is the rationalization if not just ideology?
Well, at this point, it is just ideology. Everything you said is correct, that consumers don't want them. The sales targets, it's not 2035 when the sales targets kick in. They start in 2026. It's not 100% in 2026, but it begins ramping up at that point. British Columbia and Quebec are currently in compliance with the 2026 level, but they spend a fortune on subsidies for their consumers. The rest of the country, we're not seeing EVs move off the lot in enough number. The other problem, though, and this is a focus of my column and also a paper that is coming out in the Canadian Journal of Economics, is that the auto sector itself will lose money under any conceivable technology scenario on EVs. People just aren't willing to pay the costs that it involves to own and maintain them. Yes, there are some cheap EVs. You can buy some cheap EVs and costs are coming down for some makers. But to be really indifferent between a gas-powered car and an EV, there's more to it than that. The maintenance costs are higher for EVs. The charging times, the cost of electricity. I mean, electricity is a lot more expensive than it used to be, thanks to things like the Green Energy Act. And so Hertz, for example, the big auto rental company, they went big into EVs a couple of years ago, and they've reversed course. They're selling off 20,000 EVs because they found they were too expensive to maintain and customers didn't want them. So the economics is not there under current and foreseeable technology. And I think here a good parallel is the switch from LPs and 8-track cassettes to CDs and then music streaming. if it's a good technology that saves people money and provides a superior product, they will make the switch. You don't have to force them. But if we were trying to go the other direction, so if people were currently streaming and using electronic devices, and we're going to force them to go to LPs and 8-track cassettes, obviously you'd need to bring it into law, you'd need expensive penalties for people, or you'd need massive subsidies, and the industry itself would go under because people would just rebel and they wouldn't buy the product. And that's what's going to happen with EVs. Consumers are rebelling, they're not buying the product, and the auto sector itself, I predict, will disappear in Canada as a result.
Yeah, and to be fair, the market is trying to do this. I commend Tesla in particular for really trying to change the perception of electric vehicles and make them a lot cooler, make them a lot trendier. I was at a nice wholesome weekend activity on Friday. I was at the tractor pull in Elmer, Ontario, and if you've never been to tractor pulls, they're great fun. And they had this GMC electric Hummer that was participating. And I thought they were doing it to mock the thing. I thought they were like, this was all some elaborate ruse to make fun of the electric vehicle. Man, that thing had some power. It just absolutely motored. It cleared everything else in that category. So there's an example where they've made a product that some people will like and some people want, but the market needs to be the one to cause the surge in support. And the other thing is that even support for them right now, it's very false because of those subsidies you mentioned. So it's not an accurate reflection of what consumers are willing to pay for these things.
Right. It's not an organic consumer-led transition. It's entirely dependent on policy measures. Now, Tesla reports making profits on EVs. They have aimed at the high-income market because their products are pretty expensive, but they're good cars. I mean, people obviously like them. The Cybertruck is a really impressive-looking vehicle, but they're not penetrating the middle income and lower income end of the market. Tesla is also unique. The other auto companies don't report their EV division separately, except Ford. Ford is the only company that breaks out their EV division profits, and they are losing money massively. They reported $67,000 loss per vehicle last year. It's up to $100,000 in the first half of this year. So that's obviously unsustainable. Even with all the subsidies in the world, a company is just not going to be able to continue producing a product where you lose $100,000 per vehicle. Now, in the course of doing this research, some of my readers and referees said, yeah, but the costs of producing them will come down. But that's actually not the case. Some elements are coming down. But a lot of the key ingredients into the motors used in EVs, it's sole sourced from China. China has basically a monopoly on some of the key metals that are needed for these high performance motors. And those costs are not going to come down. Instead, if anything, China is going to exploit its monopoly position to make it even harder for Western auto companies to produce these things.
Well, and we've already seen in the last few weeks even the flare up on tariffs as people try to prevent cheap Chinese EVs from being the ones that flood the market here. Let me ask you where you think this is going to go. I mean, obviously bailing out the auto sector is not entirely unprecedented. Now, drastically different circumstances to go back to 2008, 2009. But if we are seeing this scenario in the auto sector of just a mandate that is going to, cripple or decimate large parts of their operation, is that not inevitable if the government wants to fully commit to this mandate?
Yeah, in the paper that I've published, I did computations based first on an assumption maybe we get to full cost parity by 2035, but if not, maybe we'll get there by 2050. If it takes till 2050 to get full cost parity between EVs and gas-powered cars, it'll take more than $1 trillion in subsidies to keep the auto sector in existence in Canada. And if we were to get to full cost parity by 2035, it would cost about $150 billion in addition to everything that we've already spent. But the thing is, under that scenario, you don't need the mandate. If costs are going to come down so quickly and the products are going to improve so quickly that people will happily buy an EV rather than a gas-powered car, we don't need the mandate. So the key takeaway here is, in any circumstance where we need a mandate to force people to switch to EVs, in that scenario, the auto sector disappears. It can't survive. If there's a scenario where the auto sector in Canada can continue to exist and profitably produce and sell EVs, we don't need a mandate to get them onto the market.
Is there, not that I want to give anyone ideas, and I know you were mindful of that in your column as well, but if the United States were to adopt a very similar mandate, would that change the calculation? Because all of a sudden you have a scale that you don't have when it's just the Canadian market.
Well, the US right now is pretty much talking along the same lines, some states individually, but at the federal level, the Biden administration is putting in place regulations for the auto sector that do substantially the same thing. Generally, no. There are certain economies of scale that, okay, if the US begins mass producing EVs, some aspects of the cost will come down. But remember, they're going to be bidding for all those same rare earth minerals that we only get from China and the other really specialized inputs, including into battery manufacture. So that could just as easily make it harder, not easier, for us to make affordable EVs.
Well, and when you mention the battery production, I mean, we've seen the government go whole hog into trying to, do domestic EV battery manufacturing here. And that's another layer of subsidies on top of, the subsidies on the purchase of the cars themselves.
Yeah, it's amazing to listen to them brag about Canada's now this superstar in the supply chain for EV batteries. We're nothing of the sort. They had to pour $15 billion just to get one company to open a plant to make battery systems for EVs. That means that we're not a superpower in this field. It means we're singularly unsuited for producing, both in terms of the labor and then the access to the inputs and the cost of electricity and all the rest of it. If we were a superpower in this field, companies would be opening plants on their own. They'd be doing it on their own. It would be profitable, but it's not profitable. It's not profitable now. It's never going to be profitable. So all we're doing is, I think it's just, you may not remember the old hydroponic greenhouse fiasco in Newfoundland when the government of Newfoundland decided they were going to build a whole industry in the province by subsidizing hydroponic greenhouses. And they wasted a ton of money and the whole thing fell apart because, of course, there's no way to do it profitably in the province. And at the time, everybody swore up and down, never again. We're not going to fall for this. We're not going to do this again. We're doing it again, but on a much, much bigger scale, and it will come to the same end.
Yeah, and you're right to keep pointing out the inputs, because even if you have all the domestic production and domestic assembly in the world, you still are not doing anything about that choke point of the need to have the access to these minerals, which, and then in the environmental aspect, that part's often overlooked as well, is the environmental cost of mining in general, but certainly mining in China.
Right, and so with this this new push to put big tariffs on EVs, and this is kind of one of these ironies about the government. So in one office down the corridor, they're putting this rule in that says everybody's got to buy an EV, and then 2 doors down the corridor, they're alarmed at the fact that there are too many cheap EVs coming from China, so we're going to throw on heavy tariffs to try to stop them. The government created that problem, and they did it by saying to China, we're going to give you massive leverage over our industrial future. Like, I'm sure the Chinese government in Beijing can't believe their luck that Western countries like Canada and the United States are planning to phase out one of our most powerful industries and demand that people purchase an alternative product that is primarily sourced in China. And it just gives China an enormous amount of power over our economy. And there's a little bit of recognition at this point that this may not be a good idea, given the fact that China is such an aggressive and hostile entity in the world. But that's what the government is doing. And so you're going to start seeing all these contradictory policies where on the one hand, yeah, we really want EVs, and they only come from China, but we don't want China sending us EVs.
Professor Ross McKitrick, piece in the Financial Post, EV mandates don't make economic sense. And if you want to dig in a bit of a less readable but more comprehensive way for most folks, you can read his piece coming out in the journal, Canadian Journal of Economics. Ross, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today and great work on this.
Thanks, Andrew. My pleasure.
All right. Thank you. I don't mean to besmirch academic journals. You need to really settle in for them, but they're very important. I've actually started to enjoy reading some of these things because often you find how news articles about academic papers have just like woefully misrepresented what was in the paper itself, which I know has been the bane of many professors who put so much work in this, and then someone just like misrepresents it. But I promised a second Trudeau clip, but we had Ross on the line and I didn't want to keep him waiting there. This was Trudeau. I probably don't even need to play it, but we'll play it. Well, why not? We'll have some fun with it. I forget what this is. I think him explaining why he is not resigning for the umpteenth time.
There are members of your caucus that are considering leaving if you do stay on. What's your reaction to that? And are you willing to stay on and lose members of your caucus?
I think the conversations that I'm having with MPs directly right across the country, the conversations that we're all having as Liberals are going to continue, and we're going to stay focused on Canadians. I can't speak to what people in the media are thinking. That's your job. But I can speak to the strength and focus that all Liberals have on delivering for Canadians, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
A little bit sassy there. I can't speak to what the media thinks. That's your job, but I'm going to continue focusing on Canadians. Well, I think Canadians are kind of tired with what you're doing, so maybe focus on Tofino. Tofino is calling. There's the campaign that the Conservatives should do. A billboard campaign of Justin Trudeau. Actually, no. A billboard campaign of just the lonely beach in Tofino with a surfboard waiting for him, and it can be Tofino is calling. That, I think, will be the $1 million idea. All right. If someone on the True North team has like 5 extra minutes and you want to do up like a little graphic, we'll use it on tomorrow's show. All right. That's it for us for today. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you. God bless, and good day to you all.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.